In this video, we're going to talk about incorporating your data and your evidence and how to do that. So previously, we've discussed couching your quotations by using an introductory attribution, a quotation, or a paraphrase or a summary or whatever your source material is, and then a discussion of that and how to apply that. So in this case, we're going to take that and look at it sort of in a bigger picture of if that is our evidence, then how do we present that? How do we make sure that that is supporting our argument? So one thing to remember in academic writing and in other evidence-based genres, you need evidence for every reason that you present. So you have a claim and you have some number of reasons that you think that claim is valid. You need evidence to back up every one of those reasons. You should try to use a similar amount of evidence for each reason under the same claim. So if, for instance, you have 2 bullet points under one reason, then you should have 2 bullet points under another one. This is called the principle of parallelism, and it applies in a lot of different aspects of academic writing. But this is one case where parallelism will make your structure clearer and will help your reader go through each thing and not be like, oh, that seemed really weak. Why did I even read that? No. When you use parallelism, it makes it look like you really thought it through, and it demonstrates that you are thinking critically about your evidence and not just throwing everything out there regardless of how well it fits. Include your evidence at the moment that it's relevant. So don't leave your audience to guess or assume. In some genres this is appropriate, but never in academic writing. So I see a lot of times where students will write things like, it should be obvious from this point that so-and-so is true. No, don't say that, because you're assuming about your audience in that case in ways that are not safe to assume, and also you're leaving yourself open. Another thing I often see is people use rhetorical questions where they really need to use evidence. And so if you use a rhetorical question, when you're speaking and you use a rhetorical question, you can look at your audience, you can watch their reaction, and you can gauge whether or not that's working. But in writing, you may be talking to someone who is reading it 30 years later. You may be talking to someone who is 7 countries over. So you don't know what their response is in the moment. And so you can't necessarily control that the way that you would want to. So when you use a rhetorical question, you invite counterarguments and you invite criticism in a way that just stating your evidence would not do. So you want to just state things most of the time. So the other thing to do is to include warrants as needed, and this requires a certain amount of audience anticipation, and this is true for any argument. So consider this argument. You're on a committee planning an ice cream social, and you are arguing that you should serve vanilla ice cream at the ice cream social. And you have 2 reasons. Reason 1, because it's least likely to cause an allergic reaction. Reason 2, because it can be customized to people's liking with toppings. And so those are fairly strong reasons, and in your committee you might simply leave it at that. You may not need evidence. But if someone pushes you on it, they're like, no, Rocky Road is the way to go, then you can say, look, reason 1, it causes allergic reactions. We know chocolate and nuts are common allergens. That is an observable fact, so it makes good evidence. We know many people are likely to have allergies, including those that would come to the ice cream social. That is an observable fact. If you have to, you can go look up statistics for that. Now, there are warrants tying all this together. So one of the warrants, the underlying assumptions that ties our reason to our argument, to our claim, is that we want as many people to enjoy the ice cream as possible, and we don't want anyone to get sick because of the social. So those are 2 different warrants. We probably don't have to say those. I think it's safe to assume that everyone doesn't want people to get sick because of their ice cream social, and I think it's fairly safe to assume that we want as many people to enjoy it as possible. But if the argument gets to that point, you can illustrate by, you can further expand by explaining those warrants. And the same thing again for this second reason. You can make an observation that ice cream is normally served with selections of toppings. So that's a perfectly normal behavior for us to do. People will expect it. Um, and then also you can use the observation that most flavors are really just vanilla ice cream with extra toppings mixed in. Um, so that's another observable thing that you can point out. And then again, those warrants. You want as many people to be happy as possible. The number of flavors that you can offer is limited. So we didn't state this in our argument necessarily. Depending on our situation, it may have already been stated in the discussion, doesn't need to be stated, or it may simply be assumed. We know we have a low budget, so we can only offer so many flavors. So you've got several warrants there, and also we're doing a normal thing with an ice cream social, so of course there will be toppings. Why would we need to say that? So the warrants are these underlying assumptions, and they're always there, but they're not always explained. We don't always explain every value that we're expressing. In fact, most of the time we don't. In formal writing, we often do. So just be aware of that as a tool for expanding your argument and getting deeper into it. So just carefully think about your audience. Do you really need to say that? Or is it something that you can safely assume your audience agrees with you? And then there's the question of what will your audience count as valid evidence? Consider your audience very carefully, because some sources are accepted as authoritative in some groups, while not in others, and some methods of obtaining observations and facts are accepted in some groups and not in others. So consider, for instance, the use of biblical passages as evidence for an argument. So in an academic audience, they're absolutely not valid evidence. And many of you that are watching this, I'm sure, have already had this experience where you tried to use biblical passage and your professor just shut you down already and was like, no, that's not valid evidence. That has to do with the underlying assumptions and values within a given community. So not everyone in academic communities obviously shares the same religion, and that's probably a good thing, because it means our research is more diverse and so on. But as a community, we value what's called empirical evidence, that is, stuff that we can observe with physical means. So we don't necessarily value faith-based evidence or evidence based on authority. In politics, it would depend, obviously. We all know that conservatives are probably more likely to accept that evidence than liberals, depending on the demographic makeup that you're specifically addressing. That's why we do so much demographic research in politics, because we need to know our audience. However, in any case, it's not likely to be as effective as arguments based on precedent or constitutionality or legality, because you're using evidence from outside the system that you're talking about. And so you want to use evidence from inside the system as much as possible in that case. However, if you're in a religious organization, scriptural evidence may be the strongest evidence that you can use for your argument. And so you want to consider that as part of your sort of arsenal of evidence. The key thing is just always consider your audience. Likewise, scholarly articles, peer-reviewed articles, are not accepted as unequivocal evidence in every community. There are a lot of communities that don't regard academic research as valid, and so you need to consider your audience. So don't just assume that because it's peer-reviewed research, that's automatically going to be more persuasive. It may not be. So how much evidence do you need? That depends on the scope of your project and how deep your analysis of each piece of evidence is going to go. The less evidence you have, the more argumentation you have to use to build on that evidence. But don't just throw sources in to prove that you have sources. Be prepared to give a full discussion of everything that you offer. Likewise, I want to at this point out, you don't have to give a full citation for every source you introduce when you introduce it. You don't have to say, in his article titled such and such, published in such and such in the year so and so, so and so argues that. You just say so and so argues. That's all you need to say. And we'll talk a little more about that in the next video. But in conclusion, I want you to focus on incorporating your evidence by tying it to your claims. Use transitional phrases, use becauses, so that, therefores, and other transitional means to do that. Explain things thoroughly. Don't assume that your audience can connect A and B. You have to draw them and take them by the hand from A to B. And make sure that you are focusing on the ideas themselves in academic writing rather than on where the evidence came from. Where the evidence came from is going to be handled by your citations, and so you don't need to give a whole lot of explanation of that. We know where it came from; it's already there. So you want to focus on how those ideas are connected. And so that's really your goal with this research paper, is to take what's already been said, what you have to add to the conversation, and put those together in a way that we can see the connections and the ligaments that tie them together.